Autumn of 1879 held Silver Creek in the deep gold of the Montana ranges. Wind came down from the ridges and swept through the depot, carrying the scent of pine resin and the first chill of the season. When the train whistle tore through the morning, the whole town shifted for a beat, then settled back into the quiet that belonged to the frontier. Inside a third-class carriage, Isola Gray sat still as a small figure carved from dark wood. The navy dress she had worn from Missouri was creased after 1,000 miles of travel, but it was her eyes that drew notice. Dark, steady, filled with fear pressed down by years that had not healed. Her gloved hands trembled against the handle of her worn travel bag, as if letting go for even a moment would cause everything to fall from her grasp. Beyond the dusty window, Silver Creek looked strange and distant. Men wore leather coats, boots marked with dirt. Women wrapped wool shawls, children in their arms. Their eyes were firm, shaped by wind and want. None of them belonged to the world she had left behind. "We're here," someone murmured as the train came to a full stop. People moved out. Feet struck the floorboards, shoulders brushed past her, and a quiet apology drifted to her as someone passed. But Isola did not rise. Her legs no longer followed the urging of her heart. She had gone too far to turn back. Yet fear held her in place. On the platform below, Beckett Ward stood like a long shadow beneath the gold light. He was tall, built with the steady strength of a man whose life was shaped by horses and land. His face was weathered, calm, and his eyes, clear, cold as mountain water, followed every passenger who stepped down. In his hand was a photograph of a young black woman in a plain dress, her gaze slightly sad yet hopeful. He had studied it for months, enough to know her at a glance if she were truly here. But the crowd thinned. No one matched the picture. He glanced at the last letter she had sent from St. Louis. Careful, polite, carrying a faint closeness he had not expected. Yet the moment of truth came, and she was nowhere in sight. He drew a slow breath and turned toward the carriage no one had stepped from. "Maybe she changed her mind," a miner near him said. Beckett gave no answer. Something in the quiet pulled at him, a sense he could not explain. He walked to the train, tapped the metal siding, and climbed aboard. Near the back he found her, a small figure by the window, head bowed, navy dress, hair pinned neat, hands shaking. He knew it was her. "Isola Gray?" She startled, then lifted her head slowly. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, Beckett understood. She had not lost her will, only her footing. Isola recognized the man from the letters, but in person, he carried something different, a steadiness that suggested anything placed in his hands would be safe. "You're Beckett Ward?" Her voice was small but sure. He nodded once, steady and respectful. He did not step too close. He set his hat on his knee and spoke in a quiet tone. "You don't have to decide anything right now." Then he offered his hand. No force, no pull, only an open invitation. "We can take this slow. There's a hotel in town. You can stay there a while. Learn the place, no, learn me. There's no hurry." The fear in her chest loosened, thin as a draft slipping through a door. She looked at his hand a long time, the hand of a man who did not turn away from duty and would not press himself upon her life. Then, with a small courage that might change her whole future, she set her hand in his. Beckett closed his fingers around hers, gentle. Together, they stepped off the train. Montana no longer felt as frightening, because today, she did not stand alone. The road from the depot into Silver Creek stretched only a few hundred paces, yet to Isola it felt like crossing a narrow suspension bridge between two different worlds. The Montana wind swept past, carrying the scent of young pines and stone, stirring the hem of her navy dress around her ankles. Beckett walked beside her, his stride slow and even, as if he meant for his pace to match her caution. Whenever someone in town cast a searching glance their way, he shifted just slightly toward her, not shielding her entirely, but reminding her she did not have to face anyone alone. The Grand Hotel stood at the end of the main street, a 3-story lodge built of lodgepole pine, worn but clean. As she stepped onto the porch, Isola felt the eyes of those gathered there. Women with knitting baskets, old men chewing tobacco, 2 ranch hands emerging from the saloon across the road. All of them paused for a heartbeat. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. She lowered her gaze, tightening the shawl around her shoulders. Beckett held the door for her, his glance sliding over the onlookers as if to say, quietly, "She is with me." That was enough to soften a few stares. Inside, the Grand Hotel was warmer. The front desk gleamed with worn polish, and the smell of fresh bread lingered from the kitchen. An older woman with gray hair pinned high greeted them with a small smile. "Room 3, she said to Beckett, then turned her eyes to Isola, gentler. "If you need anything, call for me." Something eased inside Isola. Just for a moment, she felt less adrift. Beckett took her upstairs and set her single travel bag beside the bed. "Rest a bit," he said, his voice low, steady as the pine walls around them. "When you're ready, I'll take you to supper." She nodded. He turned to leave, but she called after him. "Ward?" He paused, met her eyes. "Thank you." One word, but heavy with courage. Beckett gave a small nod, as if he understood what it cost her to say it. That evening, the dining room glowed with warm lamplight, softer than anything Isola had imagined of the West. She sat across from Beckett, the purple shawl wrapped loosely around her neck. He ordered simple fare, potato soup, smoked meat, warm bread. Their talk began with small things: the weather, the rail ride, the horses on the Ward Ranch, the old blacksmith at the end of the street. But somehow, Isola found herself speaking of the house in Missouri where she had lived with her mother, and the fire that had taken it in a single night. Her mother's death from cold the weeks after. The years she worked odd jobs, saving enough coin to leave the place that had pressed her heart down until she could barely breathe. At that point, she lowered her head, her fingers tightening around her shawl. Beckett did not ask why she had no family. He did not ask why she had chosen a place so far from everything she knew. He only watched her, without pity, without probing, just listening, truly listening. That look warmed her chest in a way she could not name. He poured water into her glass. As he set the pitcher down, his hand brushed her fingers where they rested on the table. A brief touch, yet sharp enough to send a jolt through her heart. She drew her hand back, not from fear, but from surprise at the feeling. Beckett noticed. He dipped his head, a faint smile at the corner of his eyes. Not an apology, but a quiet acknowledgement. Strangely, that steadied her. The meal passed gently, like wind slipping through the eaves. When he walked her back to her room, Beckett said only, "Tomorrow, if you'd like. I can show you around Silver Creek." Isola nodded, not quickly, but with enough certainty that he would understand her answer was real. That night, alone in the small room, Isola stood by the window. The Montana dark spread like a velvet cloth, the mountain ridges rising black beneath a sky full of stars. Light from the nearby saloon cast a soft, honey-colored glow over the narrow street. She set her hand against the frame and drew a deep breath. Perhaps, just perhaps, her life could begin again in this unfamiliar place, and with the man who had been the first to reach out his hand. The next 3 days in Silver Creek moved at a rhythm unlike any Isola had known before. No clatter of iron wheels on rails, no dust of the old city, only clear mornings and the clean wind that drifted down from the Montana ranges. Beckett kept his word. No haste, no urging. He simply walked her through town as if opening a small door for her to see a new world at her own pace. On the first morning, he waited in the lobby of the Grand Hotel. When she came down the stairs with thin cloth gloves from Missouri, he glanced at her hands and said quietly, "The wind here's colder than you think." The words were simple, but his tone carried more care than comment. They walked along the main street, where a row of wooden storefronts lined the road. Beckett introduced each place with a slow, steady respect. Bram's General Store, the Dunford Sisters' dress shop, Old Murphy's Forge with hands the size of timber blocks. He led her into Mrs. Parker's bakery. The older woman, known throughout town for her sharp wit, narrowed her eyes in a warm smile. "So, this is the girl Silver Creek's been curious about." She placed a slice of hot apple pie into Isola's hands without taking payment. "Eat. Around here, this helps a person through most things." Isola held it with both hands. The soft tartness of the apples, the warm sweetness of cinnamon, settled in her throat like a comfort she had not felt in months. "Thank you," she murmured. Mrs. Parker only nodded, as if she had known her for years. Outside, children raced across the street with wooden hoops and branches for swords. Their laughter rose like the first notes of a place where breathing came easier. Isola watched them, and a small, unguarded smile touched her mouth. Beckett noticed. A faint softening crossed his eyes, brief but enough to send her heart into a faster beat. That afternoon, he brought her to the hot springs at the valley's edge. The trail was worn by horse hooves, flanked by tall pines whose shadows stretched long like silent marks of passing time. Steam lifted from the warm water. The late light caught between the branches, settling on Beckett in a softened glow. It made her pause. For a moment, she simply stood there, watching him with a feeling both new and unsettling, strength without noise, calm without display. Nothing about him was loud, yet everything drew her nearer. Beckett turned, catching her gaze. "This place slows a person down," he said, as if he understood exactly what had crossed her mind. "I come here when the ranch gets too heavy." She lowered her head, afraid her eyes would reveal more than she meant to show. "It's beautiful," she said. Quiet, but true. They did not speak much. They stood side by side, listening to water, wind in the pines, and the long sigh of mountains settling into evening. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt like a wool blanket laid across the shoulders. Warm enough, light enough, never suffocating. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, Isola touched the edge of her dress and glanced at him. "Ward, I'd like to walk a little by myself, only for a few minutes." Her voice carried hesitation, not asking permission, but afraid he might think she wanted distance. Beckett nodded at once. He did not ask why. He did not follow too close. "Go ahead. I'm right here." And he meant it. He let her walk the narrow path, keeping a respectful distance, never taking her space, never leaving her alone in the darkening woods. Isola moved slowly, her fingertips brushing the low pine branches. The air smelled of resin and earth, and she felt as if something in the land was calling her forward, whispering, "Keep walking. I won't frighten you." Behind her, Beckett paused whenever she paused, walked whenever she walked. A wordless guardian. When she turned back, she found him leaning lightly against a tree, his blue eyes gentled by the last light of day. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Isola no longer felt lost, partly because of the town, partly because of the wind, but mostly because of the man standing a few steps away. The next morning, Montana greeted them with a sky as clear as meltwater from spring ice. Beckett waited outside the Grand Hotel with 2 horses saddled and ready, a bay gelding for himself, and the gentlest gray mare in the herd for Isola. "Ready?" he asked. Isola looked at the horse, then at Beckett. Her worry showed plainly, though she tried to hold a small smile. "I've never ridden before," she admitted. "Then today's your first," he answered quietly. "I'll be right behind you." Simple words, but enough to steady her. When she set her foot in the stirrup, she wavered. The gray mare only tossed her head, but fear swept through Isola like a cold wind. Beckett stepped behind her, one hand steadying the saddle, the other settling lightly at her waist to help her balance. The moment was brief, but the warmth of his hand through the fabric sent a tight shock through her. Not fear, but something unfamiliar beating against her ribs. "Ease your shoulders," Beckett said, his voice low as hoofbeats on soft ground. "Let the horse feel your breath. She's gentle." Isola inhaled, then exhaled slowly. As he adjusted her hold on the reins, their fingers brushed. Once, just a faint touch, but its echo lingered, like the mark of something just beginning. Beckett swung onto his own horse, riding ahead at a slow pace so she could follow the rhythm. They left town behind, passing rows of green pines and following a dirt trail into the valley. The farther they rode, the clearer the wind grew, the land opening out like a curtain drawn aside to reveal its depth. "This place," Isola whispered, unable to finish. Beckett glanced back, a slight curve at his mouth. He didn't need to ask. Montana folk learned to hear what was left unsaid. The Ward Ranch appeared as they crested a gentle slope. Before her spread a wide valley carved from deep green. Rolling hills blended into open pasture. Far off, the snow peaks stood bright, but not cold, as if guarding rather than looming. The large timber house sat at the center, a thin plume of kitchen smoke rising from its chimney. The stables lay beside the creek. "Welcome to my home," Beckett said. Not proud, just warm, as if this land held years he hoped to share with her. They rode into the yard. The door swung open and Miguel, short, broad-shouldered, with a head of dark curls, stepped out first. "Señor Ward," he called, then turned to Isola, his eyes lighting. "Yesta es la señorita?" Beckett nodded toward her. "Miguel, this is Isola Graye." "Muy bienvenida," Miguel said with a kind smile, his handshake steady and warm. From the kitchen door, Alma, Miguel's wife, leaned out. "Ward, dinner's ready. And you, pretty girl with him, come in, let me pour you some hot cocoa." Isola let out a small laugh, the first she had given since arriving in Montana. It rang like a little bell in the fall wind. After Coco and Alma's kitchen, they walked outside and sat near the fence rail. Beckett pointed out the ranch grounds, the summer pasture, the colt's field, the old barn that had blown down in the storm of '75. "This place was hard once," he said, his voice light but carrying deep memory. There was a winter so cold, I didn't think I'd make it. Horses died. Grass died. Folks could die too if they didn't keep the fire going. Isola looked at his hands. Hands shaped by wood, rope, and long work. A thin scar ran along the back of one. "This scar from that winter?" she asked softly. Beckett seemed surprised when she brushed it lightly with her fingertip. A small touch. But like so much in Montana, small things tended to echo longest. "Yes," he said, quieter. "I was young, quick to temper, slow to learn." Isola drew her hand back, her face warming. But Beckett's eyes only softened, giving her no reason to feel ashamed. She stood and looked over the valley spread before them. The wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of pine, earth, and the plain honesty of the land. "This place," she said, still gazing far ahead, "feels real." Beckett heard her, and for the first time in years, he felt those words meant more than any praise the ranch had ever earned. That evening, Montana softened beneath the gold light of sunset. The pine ridges stood still, as if holding their breath for the day's last glow. As Isola prepared to leave the ranch for the hotel, Beckett called her back. "If you're not tired, there's a place I'd like to take you," he said, his eyes lowered to the gloves she held. Isola nodded. She said little, yet her agreement came faster than she expected from herself. The small diner on the hillside sat apart from town, only a few wooden tables and windows looking out over the valley. Not fancy, not crowded, the kind of place Montana folk sought when they needed quiet at the end of a long day. When they stepped inside, only a few patrons occupied the corners. Oil lamps glowed on the tables, casting warm light across worn grain. Beckett pulled out a chair for her, a small gesture, but it touched a warm place in her chest. As the server lit the candle on their table, Isola glanced toward the window. The Montana wind stirred the curtain, as if whispering something meant only for those patient enough to listen. Beckett sat across from her, his blue eyes heavier than usual. "You all right?" he asked. "I am," she answered softly. "It's just, this place is different from anything I've known." "Different in a good way?" he asked. Isola paused. "I'm not sure yet, but I'm trying to feel it." A faint tilt of a smile crossed his face. He rested his hands together on the table, as if ready to speak something important. "I brought you here," he began, "because I want to be clear about something." Isola lifted her eyes, a tightness forming in her chest. "I don't want you to be a mail-order bride to me." The air between them stilled. Isola opened her mouth, but Beckett raised a hand gently, asking her to let him finish. "I wrote those letters because I was lonely. The ranch is wide. Montana is wide. Sometimes a man needs a soft voice to remind him he's still human." He paused, watching her with steady depth. "But when I met you, I understood that wasn't enough. I want to know you. Truly know." Isola gripped the edge of her shawl. No one had spoken to her like that. No one had ever wanted to hear her, much less know her. After a long, quiet moment, she lowered her gaze. "I never thought I was worth something like that." "Why?" Beckett asked, gentle but direct. Isola drew a breath. Each word felt lifted from a deep place inside her. "Because for years, people looked at me like I didn't belong in their world. In Missouri, they stepped aside on the street. At the mill, they paid me less even when I worked the same." Her throat tightened. "My mother used to hold me and say, 'Don't let other people's eyes make you smaller.' But after she died, no one said that anymore. Beckett listened to every word, not interrupting once. She continued, her voice smaller. Some days I felt invisible. Beckett's hand shifted on the table. He didn't take her hand. Not yet. He simply placed his hand closer, leaving a warm space between them. In Montana, he said slowly, a person is measured by their heart. Not their skin, not their past, not what's in their pocket. His tone wasn't comfort. It was truth. Something he had lived long enough to believe. Isola looked from his hand to his eyes. For the first time since leaving home, she didn't feel small. When Beckett poured water, his fingers brushed the back of her hand. This time, Isola didn't pull away. She let the touch stay a moment, long enough for Beckett to understand that something had shifted inside her. The rest of the meal settled into a soft, easy silence. Not awkward, just the kind of quiet that made a person wish the night wouldn't end. Outside, Montana moonlight washed the hills in silver. Beckett stopped, turning toward her. Isola. He spoke gently, as if the air around them might break. If you'll allow it, I'd like to court you. Properly. Isola's breath caught. The wind brushed her hair. A brief stillness hung between them. She whispered. Then she lifted her eyes, soft but sure. Want to try? And Beckett, for the first time in years, let a true smile break across his face. A smile bright enough to carry a little more light into the Montana night. Autumn reached the Ward Ranch, with the scent of dry grass drifting on the wind and a blaze of gold settling over the distant hills. It was the harvest gathering, and Beckett asked Isola a question placed softly, as though set in his hands before he offered it to her. Will you stay at the ranch tonight? Alma can ready a room. Everyone will be here. You won't feel out of place. Isola nodded, a small gesture carrying more meaning than she dared admit. The harvest supper spread across the yard before the stables. Miguel and Alma tended the fire, the smell of roasting meat rising into the wind. Ranch hands sat in a circle, telling stories of winter, calves, and the storm last March. Isola sat beside Beckett, not touching, but close enough to feel the steadiness of his presence. When Alma set another piece of cornbread on her plate and said, "You're too thin, child. Eat more," the whole circle laughed. For the first time, Isola felt she was not a stranger. Night settled. Someone played a guitar. Others sang a few rough Spanish verses. When the dew began to fall, the group drifted off toward the bunkhouses, wishing one another good night. At last, only the wind and the fading fire remained, and the two of them. The wide yard was theirs alone. Beckett noticed Isola with her arms folded, her shoulders faintly trembling. He took a wool shawl from a chair and stepped behind her, laying it gently around her shoulders. "Montana nights cut cold," he said, his voice low. Isola drew the shawl tighter, feeling the warmth still held from his hands. "Thank you," she whispered. They stepped into the main house. The fireplace was already burning, and its glow swept across the timber walls in warm planes of light. Beckett sat before the hearth, as he always did, and after a brief hesitation, Isola sat beside him, closer than she intended. A gentle stillness settled over them. The fire cracked. Montana's wind murmured at the door. Neither wished to break the quiet. The firelight moved along Isola's cheek, softening the deep tone of her skin until it looked like a piece of night held near the flame. Beckett watched for a lingering moment before turning toward her. His blue eyes caught hers squarely. Isola didn't look away. She breathed slow, as though waiting for her heart to decide before her mind could speak. A draft slipped through the doorframe, and Isola shivered. Beckett leaned nearer, drawing the shawl higher around her neck. When his hand touched her shoulder, barely, warmth went through her spine. She couldn't tell if it came from the fire or from him. After a long pause, Isola lifted her hand, careful, slow, as if afraid to break the fragile moment, and set it over Beckett's chest, right above his heart. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. His heartbeat pressed beneath her palm, steady, strong, something she could lean into if she grew tired. He looked down at her hand, then up at her again, his eyes open and honest. "If you don't want this," he said, so low she almost missed it, "all you need to do is push me away." Isola didn't push. She stepped closer. The space between them closed slowly. No urgency, no hunger demanding to be answered. Only two people who had been alone for too long, and a Montana night quiet enough for them to hear each other's breath. Beckett lifted his hand to her cheek. His fingers were warm, gentle, as though asking whether she truly wanted this. Isola touched his hand and held it there. Her answer was clear. That night, they gave each other tenderness, not to fill emptiness, but to acknowledge feelings both had kept pressed down. They touched with the care of people who had rarely been touched with respect. They held each other as if each was entrusting the softest part of themselves to the other. No haste. No need for haste. Montana remained wide and cold outside, but Isola had never felt it warmer than she did that night. At dawn, a narrow line of light slipped through the wooden doorframe. Isola opened her eyes, still in Beckett's arms. His chin rested against her hair. His breath moved in a steady rhythm. She brushed her fingers lightly along his hand resting at her waist. And for the first time since leaving home, she thought, perhaps she had found a place to begin again. The morning after the harvest gathering, Montana sunlight slipped through the small sitting room window behind the main house. Isola and Beckett drank coffee on the porch, mist still clinging to the timber railings. Neither hurried to break the quiet. It felt as if the entire ranch was holding its breath for them. When Beckett set his cup down, he turned slightly toward her. "Isola," he said, his voice lower, less certain than usual. "Would you want to live here? Not as a mail-order bride, but as the woman I'm loving." Isola didn't answer at once. She looked toward the distant ridge, toward the slow-moving cattle, toward Beckett's arm resting loosely on the railing. She thought of the long train ride, the fear crushing her at the station, and the night before, the tenderness that had opened a new door in her chest. At last, she nodded. It was a small nod, but steady enough that Beckett looked twice to be sure he hadn't imagined it. "Then, this will be your home," he said, touching her hand lightly. No pressure, just placed there like a promise. That evening, Alma wrapped Isola in an embrace as though welcoming back a daughter lost for years. "We're glad you're here," she said, her palms warm with care. Miguel set out another set of dishes, laughing. "Now we'll be 4 at supper every night." For the first time in years, Isola felt she wasn't an extra piece in anyone's life. A week later, Isola accepted a teaching job in the little schoolroom behind the church. Wooden walls, old desks, and windows opening toward the Pine Ridge. On her first day, a few children stared with bold curiosity. One curly-haired boy asked, "Where did you come from, ma'am?" Isola knelt to his eye level. "From a far place," she said. "But from now on, I'm here with all of you." The children smiled. A little girl handed her a purple paper wreath. "To make you pretty," she said. In that moment, Isola understood. Silver Creek wasn't merely accepting her, it was inviting her in. Each afternoon, Beckett came to fetch her. Some days he leaned against the church post, dust still on his sleeves after a long day's work. Some days he led a black horse beside him, saying, "Weather's good, let's take the long way home." Those evenings stretched longer than she expected. They walked the creekside, listening to the water run. Beckett picked up a heart-shaped stone and handed it to her, pretending it meant nothing, though the tips of his ears reddened. Isola watched him repair a fence, the late light settling on his hair like a soft glow. One evening they washed vegetables together. The cold water made her laugh, and Beckett stared as though he had never heard a sound so fine neither said, "Love." They simply lived, and love grew in the quiet between small things. One Sunday afternoon, as they walked back, they found Mrs. Parker standing in her bakery doorway, arms crossed, smiling to herself. "Well now," she said, not looking at either of them directly, but speaking to them both, "it's clear enough. Silver Creek hasn't seen a pair this right in a long while." Isola flushed. Beckett dipped his head, but pride flickered in his eyes. Quiet, firm, and impossible to hide. Word traveled fast, and within days, the town's gaze toward them changed. Respect, a hint of hope, and something like an unspoken blessing. In Montana, people did not share feelings easily, but they knew when something was worth keeping. One late afternoon, Isola stood beside the creek, watching sunlight ripple across the water. Beckett stepped behind her, saying nothing, only letting his presence shield the wind from her back. Isola turned, lifting her eyes to him. "You think folks will truly accept me?" she asked. Beckett met her gaze, steady as ever. "Not just accept," he said. "They're seeing you as part of Silver Creek, the same way you're already part of me." A simple sentence, no ornament. But it set a foundation stone in Isola's heart. As they walked back to the ranch in the evening light, Isola understood something. She was no longer standing at the edge of a life. She belonged to a place, to a man, and the whole town saw her. Not as a mail-order bride, not as a stranger, but as Isola Gray, a part of Silver Creek, a part of Beckett Ward. The first snow of the season fell over Silver Creek on a quiet morning. It didn't come like Montana's harsh storms, but drifted down soft as white ash, settling on rooftops, fences, and the narrow paths she and Beckett had walked so many times. Isola stood at the bedroom window, watching the Ward Valley covered in new snow. Everything looked placed beneath a white veil, so soft, so clear, that she pressed a hand to her chest, afraid the scene might fade if she breathed too hard. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Alma entered the room, arms full of deep red fabric. "And we've got Christmas to prepare. More people this year. It'll be lively." Isola turned, smiling, her brown eyes lit by the snowlight. "What can I help with, Alma?" "Help with everything," Alma said, laughing. "Baking, trimming, hanging garlands. I want this place warm for Christmas." All morning they worked in the kitchen. Cinnamon mixed with the smell of sweet dough. Heat from the oven flushed their cheeks pink. Isola kneaded dough, flour dusting her arms, while Alma told stories of her first Christmas in Montana. Now and then Miguel slipped in to steal a piece of unbaked pastry, earning playful scolding from both women. In that simple moment, Isola felt herself belonging in a way that needed no declaration. Like the Christmas pine set in the corner, It didn't ask whether it fit. It simply gave its scent and made the house warmer. By evening, the ranch glowed with firelight. Snow still fell outside, but warmth filled the sitting room. Beckett walked in from the stables, coat dusted with white, cheeks red from the cold. The moment he saw Isola hanging the garland, he paused. A short silence, quiet as first snow. He approached slowly, as if not wanting to disturb what he saw. "You've made the ranch look different," he said, voice roughened by the cold. "Different in a good way." Isola lowered her head, hiding the smile that threatened to rise. Beckett reached into his coat. "I have something for you." He opened his hand, a handkerchief embroidered with a silver G. "G for gray," Isola whispered. "Yes," Beckett said, "because it's your name, and because I want you to know that you, just as you are, have changed this place." Isola touched the stitched letter. It was only a small square of cloth, yet her hands trembled as if she held something far more precious. Night deepened. Alma and Miguel retired to their rooms. Only Beckett and Isola remained in the sitting room, the fire burning low and steady. Isola held the handkerchief in her palms, while Beckett stood across from her, the fire casting warm light across his face, softening the blue of his eyes. "Isola," he said quietly, "come here a moment." She stepped forward. He didn't touch her right away. His hands were clasped, as if holding something steady inside himself. "From the first day I saw you on that train car," Beckett said, voice low as glowing embers, "I knew I would have to wait for something. And I waited, little by little." Isola felt her heart tremble like a candle flame in wind. Beckett reached into his coat again. This time he drew out a small pine wood box. "Beckett," she whispered, but he shook his head, asking silently for her to let him finish. He opened the box. Inside lay a simple ring, set with a small opal, milky white with a faint blue sheen, like sunlit thaw. "Not a diamond," Beckett said, "but Montana has rare opals. I wanted something born of this land, the way what I feel for you was born here." Isola raised a hand to her lips, tears catching at her lashes. "You're asking me?" she said, her voice breaking. Beckett stepped closer. "Isola Gray, will you marry me? Not because of letters. Not because of fear of where your life was headed. But because we found something real here." 1 second. 2. The whole world held still. Then Isola nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks like the season's first melt. "Yes," she said, "I will." Beckett slid the ring onto her hand, and when he drew her into his arms, his warmth erased the cold of all Montana outside. Beyond the window, snow kept falling, but inside the wooden house of the Ward Ranch, that winter became the warmest either of them had ever known. Spring reached Silver Creek on thin bands of sunlight across the fields and meltwater running down from Ward Peak. Beckett and Isola's wedding took place on such a morning. Unadorned, quiet, beautiful enough that Alma had to turn away to wipe her eyes. Townfolk stood in 2 long lines along the trail leading to the mountain's base. Each carried wildflowers. Some brought bread, some corn whiskey. Father Clyde waited beneath an old pine, its branches filtering the light into bright rings around the bride. Isola wore the cream dress Alma had sewn by hand. It held to her slender frame as if meant for this day. A light breeze curled soft strands of hair around her cheeks, and Beckett, standing at the end of the path, looked at her with pride he made no effort to hide. When her hand met his, Beckett tightened his fingers, the way one holds something precious and fragile. The pastor spoke his blessing. Wind stirred the branches. The creek below carried the vow onward like its own witness. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Beckett lowered his head and kissed her brow, a quiet kiss, yet it made the whole valley seem a shade brighter. Life after the wedding wasn't a fairy tale. It was mud on boots at dawn during feeding time, the creak of wooden doors in a hard wind, the slow work of two people learning how to share one steady rhythm. Isola became Mrs. Ward in the truest sense. She kept the ranch books, helped decide when to buy hay and when to widen the corral. Some days she stood outside speaking with Miguel. Other days she rode beside Beckett along the fence line. Tired? Beckett often asked. No, she'd say, just learning how to be a Montana woman. And he would smile, the kind of smile rare on a man who had spent too many years alone. One summer afternoon, Isola stood by the creek, a hand resting on her stomach, a secret held in her dark eyes. When Beckett rode toward her, he knew something had changed. She spoke softly. Beckett, we're going to have a child. He said nothing for several seconds. Then he stepped down, drew her into his arms, his embrace trembling. Thank you, he whispered, his voice breaking. Thank you for everything. The months that followed were a strange mix: weariness, joy, and worry. Beckett stayed close to her, so close at times that Alma teased, "He'll smother the poor girl if he doesn't give her some air." Isola knew the truth beneath it, a quiet fear inside him of losing the one gift life had given him so late. The birth came on a windy morning. Silver light filled the room, and Isola clutched Beckett's hand with every surge. "I'm here," he said, hoarse with panic. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Alma and an older midwife worked beside the bed, but the labor lasted longer than expected. Sweat gathered on Beckett's brow, more than on hers. Each time Isola cried out, he gripped her hand tighter, as though letting go might cost him everything. "Beckett, I'm scared," she gasped. He bent and pressed his lips to her hand. "I know," he said, "but you're strong, stronger than this land." The words broke her into tears, and moments later, a thin, sharp, strong cry filled the room. A little girl, skin the color of warm honey, curled hair soft as thawed snow. Isola held her close. Beckett stood beside them, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the bed frame to steady himself. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice tight. "Looks like you." Isola looked up. "What shall we name her?" Beckett answered only after a long moment. "Leora. It means light." And when he kissed Isola's forehead, it was no longer the kiss of a man who had been alone for years. It was the kiss of a husband, a father, a man who had found his true home. The days that followed were filled with newborn cries, the smell of milk, and the wind knocking softly at the door at night. The Ward Ranch changed. Everything grew softer, brighter. Townfolk visited with blankets, milk, and blessings. They looked at Isola and Beckett as though seeing something rare and good still left in this rugged land. And Isola understood more clearly than ever. Family wasn't something written in letters. It was something earned in the first trials and held together by a love that didn't run when the hard moments came. That August, Montana burned hotter than the years before. Ward Creek, once full and steady, had thinned to a ribbon of silver water. Beckett stood at its edge, hat gripped tight, his face drawn. Behind him, Isola held Leora and felt the heavy silence of a land long used to the sound of running water. The news arrived on the third morning. Jasper Thornhill, wealthiest man in Silver County, had filed for the right to divert Ward Creek toward the new property he had bought upstream. It meant drought for the Ward Ranch, scorched fields, and cattle that would not survive. "That's impossible," Beckett said, eyes fixed on the notice. "This water has run through our lands since before my grandfather was born." Isola took the letter from his hands, reading slowly. She saw clearly the one thing Beckett was trying to hide, the helplessness a gentle Montana man hated to show. That evening, after Leora had fallen asleep, Isola sat at the long table. She lit the oil lamp and spread every document she could find. Land deeds, old maps, letters from Beckett's grandfather. "What are you doing?" Beckett asked. "Fighting," Isola said, "but in my way." The next morning, she walked into the Silver Creek courthouse. The officials looked at her, a black woman arriving alone, with eyes both curious and cautious. She did not flinch. Montana had taught her to stand straight before the wind. "I want the state's water law," she said to the clerk, "and any frontier records from the 1830s through the 1860s. The clerk blinked. "What do you need all that for?" "To find the truth," Isola said. "Nothing more." She read for 3 hours. Montana's water law differed from other states. Here, water belonged to the first user, not the richest. Then she found it, a yellowed record from 1842. Ward Creek first claimed by Eli Ward, Beckett's great-great-grandfather. It also stated the creek as a primary source of livelihood that shall not be diverted if it endangers the downstream community. "There it is," Isola whispered. A thin, sharp beam of hope. The hearing took place days later. Jasper Thornhill entered with 3 lawyers and a long, fur-lined coat. Beckett walked in with his old hat, calloused hands, and a face marked by sun and wind. And Isola. She wore a deep indigo dress, her hair pinned neat, holding the file she had read until she knew it by heart. When the judge asked who represented the Ward Ranch, Beckett started to rise. But Isola placed her hand on his, light, firm, certain. "I'll speak," she murmured. "This is our fight, and you don't need to do what you're not made for." Beckett looked at her, blue eyes steady on the woman he trusted more than himself. He nodded. Isola stood. Her voice was not loud, but clear and grounded like the Montana range. "Your Honor, under Montana water law, the first user holds the right to the original flow. The Ward Ranch has relied on this creek for over 80 years. No one may divert it, no matter his wealth." Jasper's lawyer scoffed. "And what gives you the right to speak on the law?" Isola opened her file. "The right of truth." She laid out each piece. The 1842 frontier record, the old flow maps, Section 3 of the 1870 water statute, proof that the Ward Ranch was the downstream community entirely dependent on the source. Her voice stayed even, sharp as winter wind. The room fell silent. When the judge stepped away to deliberate, Beckett held her hand beneath the table. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. She lifted his hand to her cheek. "I'm doing what needs to be done to keep our land." The ruling was read to a still room. The court denies the petition of Mr. Jasper Thornhill. Water rights remain with the Ward Ranch. No diversion is permitted. Jasper flushed red, hurled his hat to the floor, and stormed out. Beckett did not watch him leave. He watched Isola, the woman who had saved the ranch and their future with her mind, her resolve, and her faith in what was right. He embraced her there in the courthouse, ignoring every stare. "You're stronger than Montana," he murmured. Isola smiled, a soft spring smile. "No, I'm strong because you stand with me." Outside, sunlight poured over Silver Creek, wide, bright, and opening into a new season for the Ward family. Montana changed seasons through the smallest signs. A thinner layer of morning mist over the fields, a louder chorus of birds on the stable roof, and the quiet marks of growing up on the faces of the children. Leora, the baby who once cried through a storm morning as Isola labored, had become a young woman with her mother's deep brown eyes and her father's upright stance. Their second child, Caleb, carried the energy of spring across the Ward ranch, always chasing the horses, always dust-covered, eyes burning with life. One early summer day, Beckett leaned against the porch rail, watching the two race across the grass. He said nothing, but Isola knew what that moment did to him. "They're growing fast," she said, resting her hand on his arm. "I never thought I could raise them," Beckett replied, voice low and soft. "But you always believed." Isola leaned her head against his shoulder. Montana had evenings that made a person grateful in silence. Years after the water rights victory, the Ward Ranch grew into what the townspeople called the lifeline of Ward Valley. Miguel and Alma were old now, yet each autumn they stood in the yard watching the tall wagons of hay roll past, smiling with the pride of long, honest labor. New ranch hands sought work there, drawn by the good name Isola and Beckett had kept since the days of Beckett's grandfather. Isola taught school for many years, her classroom always filled with children's laughter. She was patient like Montana soil, gentle like spring water, and her devotion stretched far beyond the town. One late autumn morning, a letter arrived from Helena. The Montana Education Council had nominated her as their new chairwoman. She stood quietly by the window after reading it. The valley wind slipped through, light as a hand resting on her shoulder. When Beckett returned and saw her holding the envelope, he pulled off his leather glove and touched her hand. "Good news?" he asked. She handed him the letter. His eyes brightened as if seeing his daughter for the first time all over again. "Isola," Beckett said, voice tightening as if holding back too much emotion. "You did it. You, the woman who once feared stepping off a train, now lead the education of the entire state." Isola laughed softly, eyes glimmering. "I only did it for the children." Beckett shook his head, placing both hands on her cheeks. "No, Isola. Silver Creek is better because of you. The Ward Ranch is better because of you. I am better because of you." He spoke slowly, like a private vow only Montana wind would hear. "You are the heart of Silver Creek." Her appointment became the town's pride. Mrs. Parker baked an apple pie and brought it over. The church rang its bells when she returned from Helena. Children she once taught ran to her, clinging to her skirts, laughing as though the honor were theirs, too. To the town, Isola was no longer the black woman who stepped off the train years ago. She was the one who had carried light into their lives, with knowledge, patience, and steady kindness. One soft golden evening, Isola and Beckett stood atop the northern hill of the ranch, overlooking the Ward Valley. The light lay across the roofs, the pines, the long fences like a warm cloth. Leora was leaving for school in town. Caleb was running horses in the last sun of the day. Montana stretched wide below them, like a silent prayer that needed no words. Beckett stood behind her, arms around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder, the same way he had held her for years. "Look," he whispered. All we've built. Isola held his hands. And all they will build after us. The highland wind passed over them. Two lives that once stepped into each other with shy hearts now stood firm as the hill beneath their feet. Montana had 4 seasons, but their love had ripened into a 5th, steadfast, full, and lasting like a harvest that never fails. Winter came to Montana in quiet mornings, when snow settled on the front steps, and even the cattle's calls from the valley sounded slower. Beckett was an old man now, silver-haired, blue eyes deep as a winter lake. But his stance remained the same, straight and gentle, as if one hand was always ready to steady someone. That year, Beckett fell gravely ill. A sudden cold fever struck in the middle of the night, dropping him beside the stove. Alma was too old to help Miguel. Miguel's hands trembled as he carried warm water. The ranch panicked, and Isola never left his bedside. She sat there, pressing a warm cloth to his forehead, changing the water, her eyes fixed on the face that had shared nearly half a century with her. "Beckett, can you hear me?" Her voice broke. His hand tried to move. Weak fingers found hers and closed. No strength like before. No steadiness. But enough to say, "I'm still here." For 3 days and nights, Isola didn't leave the room. She only slept when she collapsed against his arm. Leora and Caleb brought food upstairs, most of it growing cold before she remembered it was there. On the 4th morning, when the sun spread a thin pink line over the valley, Beckett opened his eyes. He looked around the room, then stopped at Isola asleep on his arm. He lifted a shaking hand and adjusted the shawl on her shoulder. "You're still here," Beckett whispered. She woke at the warmth of that touch, and when she saw his eyes open, she cried, silent tears running down their joined hands. "You frightened me," Isola murmured. "I'm sorry," Beckett said. "There's more I want to live long enough to see with you." As Beckett regained strength, they spent long hours on the porch, watching the valley shift through the seasons. One early spring afternoon, Isola opened the wooden box Beckett's grandmother once kept. Inside were old letters, faded photographs, and a blank leather-bound journal. "Beckett," she said softly, "let's write our story." He gave a slow smile, gentle as ripples on a lake. "What do you mean?" "The story of 2 people who met at a Montana station. The man who waited, and the woman who almost didn't step off the train." Beckett picked up a pen, his hand unsteady with age. She placed her hand over his, steadying the stroke. On the first page they wrote, "The woman who almost stayed on the train." Page by page the memories opened. Afternoons by the creek, the first winter, the hard birth, the water dispute, the victories, the losses, the children's laughter, Alma and Miguel growing old, the Montana wind always humming its quiet song outside. The book wasn't written for the world. It was for their children, for the town, for anyone who needed to know that love wasn't built from one bright moment, but from decades of steady persistence. For their 50th anniversary, Silver Creek held a small ceremony near the old church. Townsfolk stood in 2 lines like they had on the wedding day, but now their hair was gray, their steps slower, and their eyes fuller from witnessing the Ward family's love for 50 years. When Beckett and Isola stepped from the wagon, applause rose, soft, sincere, steady as the town's own heartbeat. Mrs. Parker, now bent over a cane, handed Isola a bouquet of lavender. "You kept Silver Creek gentle," she said. Father Clyde, hands shaking with age, placed a hand on Beckett's shoulder. "You made Montana proud." No one said it aloud, but every gaze agreed. They were one of the town's finest memories. That evening, they returned to the ranch. The Montana sunset fell like a wide golden cloth across the valley, tinting everything with honey light. Isola and Beckett sat on the long porch bench, the one he had built from pine years ago. Their hands intertwined, familiar as an old prayer. Montana shifted colors by the minute. Gold slid to orange, then to quiet violet. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. After a while, Beckett tilted his head slightly, his voice low, almost careful not to disturb the wind. "Thank you." He paused as if letting his heart speak first. "For stepping off that train." Isola leaned into his shoulder. "And thank you for waiting for me," she answered. In that generous sunset, the love that had traveled half a century sat with them again, quiet, complete, and steady as the Montana plains. If this story touched your heart, feel free to share a few words below. Have you known a love as steady as theirs, or a regret that still lingers? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone you cherish, so each evening we can meet again in stories warm as this. Wishing you a peaceful night.